All right, so we're back in the book Atlantis in America, Navigators of the Ancient World by Ivor Sapp and George Erickson. We go to chapter 1 of this book, and it says here, in 1940, the United Fruit Company was clearing the Diquis Delta region of southwest Costa Rica of its jungle covering to establish a banana plantation when workers happened upon what would later prove to be vast astronomical gardens. All right. They first found the upper parts of huge stone balls, but when the curious workers dug the surrounding soil out at some considerable expense of energy, they discovered they had uncovered great spheres, some measuring over 9 feet in diameter, and later found to weigh as much as 20 tons. These great balls had once been held aloft by a series of supporting mounds and had been surrounded by stone statues and stelae. Over time, most of the colossal spheres sunk into the ground. Sunk, or were they covered? Some as much as 2 meters below the surface. The spheres caught the interest of Doris Stone, an archaeologist and the wife of general manager of the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica. Stone, in 1949, brought the spheres to the attention of Harvard archaeologist Samuel K. Lothrop while he was in Costa Rica examining other sites. Intrigued by Stone's reports, Lothrop traveled to Diquis Delta, where he was amazed not only by the size of the granite spheres, but even more impressed by the precision with which massive granite blocks had been carved into perfect spheres, having the same diameter and circumference when measured from any point on the sphere. Even the largest were found to be spherical, to within a few hundredths of an inch. Lothrop, an established authority on Peruvian and Central American archaeology, had come to Costa Rica to study the ceramics of the Chorotega Indians. Okay, have this in my ancestry. But there was nothing that Lothrop had encountered in his investigations of the Chorotega, then thought to be the earliest known organized culture in what is now Costa Rica, that suggested the abilities to construct so large and so precise a megalith. And there were hundreds of these mysterious spheres in the Diquis region, all right, hundreds of these, and hundreds more, if not thousands, in the surrounding mountains, okay? There's thousands of these spheres all over Costa Rica. Since the Chorotega lacked the technology to build them, and since there was no known presence in Mesoamerica of an earlier and more sophisticated culture, the spheres became an enigma. Lothrop declared that the site and the spheres were out of context. They simply did not fit within any Mesoamerican context known to Americanist archaeologists. And since the established theories that dated pre-Columbian Costa Rican culture could not be questioned, the spheres themselves had to be dismissed. All right, so you hear what they're saying? It didn't fit their narratives, you know, because this is from an old advanced culture that was here in Costa Rica that built these spheres, these perfect round spheres. The technology, they can't even do it today. Lothrop made no attempt to date the spheres, although he expressed the opinion that they were much older than surrounding sites. He took accurate measurements of the spheres and mapped their layouts and their arrangements in groups. Upon inquiry, he managed to correlate the spheres to local folklore and myth that the spheres were related to the phenomena that takes place in the sky. A few Indians told him that the spheres had something to do with the cyclical movement of the sun, moon, and the stars. All right, and here's one of them right here they have in the book. It says here, sphere that has been removed from its original site and sits on a lawn in Palmar Sur, Costa Rica. But we have a lot of these rich people, you know, or municipal buildings or anything, they have them in the front of their buildings or their garden, you know. It's like, yeah, look, we took it, you know. After Lothrop's brief study of the spheres presented in archaeological remains of the Diquis Delta of Costa Rica, few archaeologists outside Costa Rica showed any interest in these great spheres. When their evidence was first presented, an issue of Natural History magazine, 1955, declared that it is thought that the civilization that manufactured these spheres must have been highly advanced. But because they did not fit into the preconceived context and pretext, archaeologists in general avoided dealing with these megaliths. A few academics and researchers declared that the spheres were the work of the native Boruca Indians, another culture that never showed any ability to construct such megaliths, and casually gave them a probable date from the 9th to the 20th century AD. Over the years, the spheres hidden in the midst of a large banana plantation in a remote and steamy jungle lay forgotten by all but the occasional looters who found a way to truck them to the gardens and lawns of wealthy Costa Ricans living in the Central Highlands. This is what I was saying. All right, these conquistadors, descendants, and all these people, these hijacks, you know, now they got it in their lawns. All right. Through uncertainty and neglect, an important archaeological discovery was categorized as an enduring enigma and abandoned to the banana fields. When Ivar Sapp entered the picture, the spheres had become an all but forgotten local riddle. Fascinated by the spheres, Ivar, while teaching in the School of Architecture at the University of Costa Rica in 1981, took his students on a field trip to the steamy Diquis Delta. After an examination of the spheres still in situ, he proposed a series of interesting questions to his students. Who built them? How were they built? How were they transported to a place so far from any rock quarries? How were the other spheres found high in the coastal mountains of Costa Rica possibly moved there? Then Ivar asked his students to ignore these questions and instead concentrate on another. Since so much thought and effort had gone into the construction, polishing, and geometric perfection of these spheres, what could have been the function of these megaliths? His students, though fascinated by the objects, enigmas in the jungle mist, had no ready answer. But then neither did Ivar. His field trip was meant to be an exercise in awareness of architectural function. But the questions Ivar raised to his students came to dominate his own thoughts. What could the function of these spheres have been? Ivar had long been interested in the work of John Michell, whose orientation of the ley lines of Stonehenge and other sites in Britain pointed to ancient knowledge of the Earth's integral position under heavenly bodies. Mitchell's investigation established the relationship of the Celts, through their architectural constructions, not only to solar and astral entities, but also to other ancient structures in Giza in Egypt, to the Etruscans, and to the builders of Baalbek in Phoenicia. Could something similar have occurred in the far distant past in Costa Rica? All right, and it says here, configurations of the spheres of Costa Rica. The layout of the spheres as found and diagrammed by S.K. Lothrop. Spheres E and F are now in the Museo Nacional in San Jose, Costa Rica. So this is how they were found in a line. And this was, look at this, looked like a constellation or something, right? Or it could be something else. Professor Sapp and his students first studied the layout of the spheres that remain in situ. Then they consulted the layouts made 42 years earlier by Lothrop. They found that in most cases, the stones were arranged in groups of 3 forming a triangular configuration. Ivar noticed that an axis line formed between 2 major groups of the spheres was oriented to the magnetic North Pole, indicating that the builders had a knowledge of the magnetic compass. Ivar, on intuition, then took a Mercator atlas and projected the directional lines implied by the layout of the spheres. The implied lines of the spheres missed contact with other significant sites by as much as 400 miles. But the Mercator atlas, long used by European navigators, is flat, and the Earth is a sphere. Using a globe and consulting maps that reflect the dimensions, Ivar found that the 19 degrees southwest inclination of the line that intercepted spheres E and F, projected from the Palmar Sud side in the Dickies Delta, leads to Cocos Island, to the Galapagos Islands, and then to Easter Island. In fact, smaller but similarly perfect spheres have been found on Easter Island, but these spheres have been moved. So if they once pointed back to the Americas, this access to knowledge is now lost. The directional line implied by spheres D and F project a line that, followed to the northeast, leads to the Straits of Gibraltar. If projected southwest, leads to the Marquesas. In another group, the axis leads to the Great Pyramids of Giza. In another, it leads to Stonehenge. In every case, the megaliths of Costa Rica pointed to great megaliths of distant lands and islands. You hear what they're telling you here, right? It was pointing everywhere, telling you where they were in the world. It was like a map. It says here, right, the lines of sphere E and F projected from the Palmar Sud side in the Dickies Delta lead directly to Cocos Island and the Galapagos Island, and then to Easter Island. And it says here below, national directional lines of the spheres of Costa Rica. All right, so they're going to show you how it leads to different parts. You see how they all gather right here in the middle. And as you can see, Central America is the middle. Central, you see, is right on the Caribbean. This part probably had more land before, you know. And you see how all these lines are heading somewhere important. Sight lines on a flat map or even a small globe are one thing. Sight lines on an actual sphere, our Earth, are another. The EF projection line of the spheres of Dickies Delta was tested by a pilot friend of Ivar's using the arc geometry of an onboard computer on a Boeing 727. The result of this test showed that 19 degrees directional line extended over 7,000 plus kilometers from Costa Rica resulted in a projected flight that missed Easter Island by 70 kilometers, 42 miles. At first, this result bothered Ivar, but a 72-kilometer miss in long-range ocean voyaging has been demonstrated by the Polynesians to be a virtual hit. Experienced and able navigators need not make a precise strike on an island destination. By reading swell patterns in waves and cloud formations both disturbed by the presence of islands, and by observing the presence of land-based birds, such as terns or nudis, navigators can detect the position of an island 100 kilometers before sighting it. Were the ley lines of Celtic megaliths and the sight lines of the spears of Costa Rica coincidences? If so, why did one implied sight line, formed by the three great spears, point directly to Stonehenge? Ivar was certain that such implied directional paths could not be merely coincidental. He believed that he had discovered something very similar to the ley lines, by which the Druids of Britain connected Stonehenge and Glastonbury with ancient Greek, Etruscan, and Egyptian sites. He then realized that he had possibly led his university students out of their classrooms in San Jose and onto the grounds of a far more ancient university. But the question of function and purpose haunted Ivar. If the spears represented terrestrial directions rather than or in addition to star paths, what were the students of this ancient university being taught? Then it came to him navigation. Surely these students of old were being taught how to navigate both the heavens and the seas. The implications of such a theory went far beyond anything that Ivar had encountered in his studies. Even John Michell had only expressed his ley lines as sight lines. Navigational theory had not entered Michell's theories or proposals. Thus, Ivar realized that he would need to look beyond the published archaeological records for traces of ancient navigators, launching an investigation that would dominate the next 14 years of his life. Ivar pursued the question through an examination at actual sites of the known archaeological record, reappraised to include the possibility of navigation as the means by which man's ideas migrated from one continent to another, just like we were reading in the other book, how we passed the culture around. On assignment, one of Ivar's students, Umberto Carro, found evidence of the use of an ancient sextant used by Arab navigators. All right, listen to this. Muslim Arab navigators, the Moors, that was described in detail in the 13th century manuscript that became the basis for the classic, The 1001 Arabian Nights. Through the character Sinbad, the sailor, the tales contained in this classic probably depicted adventures of many Sinbads, stretching back to hundreds of sailings over thousands of years. It was the use of these voyages of a rectangular sextant. All right, we're going to show the images. All right, this is what we're just reading about. Called a kamal by the Arabs that caught Carro's attention. The kamal was made of two wooden rectangles united by a long knotted cord. Each knot on the cord represented the latitude of a known port. Northern ports were represented by knots closest to the rectangle. Ports closer to the equator were represented by knots that permitted a fuller extension of the arm, effectively lowering the sighting latitude of the kamal. By holding the knot represented a port and his teeth, and extending the kamal with its edge on the horizon and pointing it at Polaris, the accomplished navigator could determine his position relative to the latitude of his destination. All right, so when I read this, it says here, knotted cords, and it shows this guy. Tim Severin demonstrates the use of the kamal and knotted cord in a National Geographic magazine article in July 1982. 13 years later, in an article of Maya murals at Bonampak. All right, in Bonampak, they had the same image. Knotted cords extending from the mouth, believed by the present authors to be a vestige of a degenerate naval traditions, are described as examples of barbaric torture and ritual savagery. All right, they're trying to say, they said, oh no, they're just doing some barbaric stuff, but it was actually the Mayas and the people in Costa Rica and ancient America were actually using this to help them navigate. All right, now let's go look at some examples of this. All right, as it says here, if Polaris appeared above the height of the kamal, the sailor had ventured north of his destination. Okay. If Polaris appeared below, the sailor was too far south. If the North Star aligned with the rectangle, the ship and destined port were on the same latitude, and the sailor was on course. All right, and then we have this image right here. This is made out of gold. I'm going to show you guys one day. I'm going to go to the Gold Museum and show you some real live artifacts here in Costa Rica of this. There's so many of these found here. And these were navigational tools. These are navigational tools, guys. You see, he's doing it too. It says figures with knotted cords extended from their mouths often tethered to rectangular shapes, have been found throughout the Diquis Delta region of Costa Rica. Surely these were navigational instruments, not torture devices. I dodged the hijack. That was by R.A. Jairas Hoy, Ancient Egyptians and Chinese in America. All right, that's another book we're going to get into. Notes that in both ancient America and Egypt, gods are depicted with the odd characteristic of a double twisted rope issuing from their mouths. Another similarity is the Egyptian custom of placing small strips of papyrus by the dead and the Mexican custom of placing bunches of paper with dead. Obviously, both people had a belief in the power of the written word to transcend earthly life, but it could not transcend nor long survive the burnings and desecration of less enlightened cultures that followed. All right, that was when the Moors and Sephardic Jews came, the less enlightened. You know, they burned up everything, and the Catholics. What struck Ivar and his student Umberto was that knotted rope extending from the mouth was very similar to a repeated motif on pottery and gold pendants that Lothrop had found in association with the spheres of Diquis Delta. Lothrop characterized these numerous items as representing snake coming out of the mouth at a deity. All right, you hear that? See what they were saying? That's rope they had. And this guy, this hijack archaeologist that was here in Costa Rica, this guy named Lothrop, he was probably sent as an agent, gatekeeping, and he's saying, yeah, that's nothing, that's not rope or navigators, that's just snakes coming out of his mouth. He's a deity. But Ivar had believed them to be simply units of measure. Again, Ivar had questioned their function. Now he felt he had an answer. If his hypothesis was correct, it was a geographically large answer. This same symbolism, the knotted cords coming out of the mouth, has also been depicted in pre-Inca burial sites in Peru, and on stela and the archaeological sites of Copan in Honduras, and Bonampak and Xachilang in the Yucatan. In India, similar depictions have been found in pre-Aryan sites in the Indus Valley and among the followers of Shiva, the Hindu god of destruction. This discovery only made Ivar more determined to find other instruments that could serve a common function among diverse ancient naval cultures. Again, Umberto Caro came up with the key evidence. He found an article among the reports to the 23rd Congress of Americanists held in Costa Rica in 1952 by Thor Heyerdahl, which explained the technique of sailing balsa rafts against the currents and against the wind. In the article, Heyerdahl shows how the ancient Peruvians were able to achieve this counter-current navigation by use of removable centerboards called guara, functioning like keels, but in use in the Americas for thousands of years before the keel was invented. 7 to 12 foot long guaras were inserted between balsa logs and lifted or lowered to achieve the desired tacking effect. Centerboard navigation in great rafts that carried from 50 to 75 men and 20 to 40 tons of cargo was in wide use at the time the first Spanish came to Peru. When Francisco Pizarro's fleet reached the northern coast of the Inca Empire, they encountered a whole flotilla of balsa rafts carrying Inca soldiers. The Spanish were surprised by the number of rafts and by their great size, almost equal to their own caravels. All right, almost equal to their ships. But to the Spaniards, the most amazing thing was that the rafts were moving swiftly toward them. All right, and they were fast, against the current and against the wind. Curious, Pizarro managed to draw alongside several of the rafts. The Incas were as curious about the Spanish and allowed them to board. The Spaniards, initially pretending to be friendly, boarded the vessel, threw 11 of the crew overboard, left 4 to the raft, and took 2 men and 3 women prisoners to be trained as interpreters. Do you hear what these Sephardic Moorish Catholics did when they came over here? You see, they tricked them. They were being friendly, the Indians in Peru. All right, they were being friendly, these indigenous people, and then they tricked them. All right, threw 11 of them overboard and imprisoned the rest of them. Pizarro's contemporaries recorded the secret of balsa raft navigation, although they didn't fully understand it at the time. Pizarro and his men were told of balsa journeys along the entire coast of South America. They were also given directions on how to sail to Easter Island and to Polynesia, all right? They were telling these Spaniards, these Moors, Sephardic Jews, how to get to Polynesia from here. Sure, you can just go that way, trust us. We do it all the time. But Pizarro had little interest in sailing techniques or directions to Polynesia, or any obscure or fancied and distant islands. Through his captive interpreters, he learned that the reason for the great number of Balsa rafts full of soldiers he had encountered was that the Incas were involved in a bloody civil war. Pizarro's quest for El Dorado, the legendary city of gold, yeah, the civil war gave him the opportunity to use the Inca people against one another, utilizing the high esteem conferred on him, that of the returning god Viracocha. Pizarro organized an army of Peruvians deeply angry at the Inca regime. His expedition, fortified by thousands of Indians, pushed inland high into the Andes to capture Cusco, the Inca capital, a city covered with gold. Again, Cusco, huh? What is Cusco? The city of David, Prester John, the city covered with gold? Remember, Marco Polo said that the great Khan city was covered with gold. He went all the way to Cusco. Marco Polo went all the way to the farthest east, the real, superior India, the farthest east. This is Asia. So they got a bunch of hijacked Indians, right, who allied themselves because they had war with the other indigenous people there in the Inca Empire. They had a civil war. They allied themselves with the Moors and the Sephardic Jews and went against the other indigenous people to capture Cusco, the Inca capital, a city covered with gold. Within 2 years, the Incan Empire fell to the Spanish. Centerboard sailing on balsa rafts survived for a few generations, then was all but forgotten. But historic accounts, most written by chroniclers accompanying Pizarro and other Spanish conquistadors, remain. And wooden guaras, some carbon 14 dating to thousands of years before Pizarro's conquest of Peru. Thousands of years, these so-called rafts, all right, these ships, these boats, are still being found in the deserts of Peru. They're still finding them there, thousands of them. A serious obstacle to rediscovering Costa Rica's past navigational culture and its climate and soil. Peru's extremely dry climate and sandy soil permitted preservation. Wooden guara boards are not the only objects to survive millennia of neglect. Mummies, 3,000 years older than the oldest mummies found in Egypt, have recently been uncovered in the high deserts of southern Peru and northern Chile. All right, we've gone over this in my past videos that Chinchorro mummies are the oldest mummies in the world, predating anything in Africa and the Sudan and Egypt, anywhere in the world, okay? Do the research or go watch the video. I show you the sources. By contrast, in Costa Rica's tropical wet climate and highly acidic soil, wood, flesh, and bones disintegrate quickly. All right, that's one thing about Costa Rica. Things here, the rain, all that, things just, disintegrate. No records of rafts, ships, or wooden guara boards, or the people who used them could survive in such a climate. So even the bones, all right, disintegrate. That's something I didn't really think about, so a lot of the, bones that could have been tested and all these things are gone, here in Costa Rica. The climate here, again, is very tropical, as they're saying here. In fact, no wooden guaras have been found in Costa Rica. Yet, Ivar immediately recognized that a curious event occurred on the first encounter of Europeans with native Costa Ricans. Christopher Columbus was long considered to be the first historical navigator to reach the Americas from the Old World, all right, in parentheses. On his first 3 voyages, Columbus encountered only islands, which he believed to be the East Indies. But on his 4th voyage, determined to find the Asian continent, he found instead another continent making landfall near present-day Limon, Costa Rica. All right, so Limon, Puerto Viejo's, I did one of the videos recently where I went to Puerto Viejo, Limon. The place he actually landed was not far from there, about 5 kilometers or less, probably less, like 2 kilometers. Playa Ubita in Limon, Puerto Viejo, Costa Rica. That's where Columbus set foot. Little beautiful place over there. Columbus has become a boring topic of discussion, but as his encounter in Costa Rica has particular significance, Because of the size of their ships, Columbus and his party were accepted as great navigators by the native Costa Ricans. Columbus' son Diego reported how their party was taken, almost immediately upon arrival, on a 2-hour walk to the burial of an important person. Diego describes the lapida that the dead man was laid out on, and describes a prow of a ship underneath him. From this account and other evidence, it has generally been accepted that these lapidas were both the bearers and the grave covers of priests and kings. All right, listen to this. I can't make this up. All right, Drop Nation, you hearing? Priests, kings, a Khan. From this account and other evidence, it has generally been accepted that these lapidas were both the bearers and the grave covers of priests and kings. A priest and a king here in Costa Rica. On examining the lapidas, what Ivor realized was that the guaras, centerboards of Peru, and the lapidas of Costa Rica were virtually identical in size, just like the Peruvians' shape and ornamentation. No one had noted their similarities before, but no one had been looking for naval implications to Costa Rican sites. If the stone funeral slabs of Costa Rica were identical to the functional wooden guaras of Peru, why have stone slabs at all? They would be too heavy for practical utilization. The use of lapidas as freestanding stone slabs on mounds and as part of the statuary of ceremonial centers at Guayabo had long puzzled archaeologists. Right, Guayabo is an archaeological site here in Costa Rica. I'm going to bring you guys there one day. Okay, what the archaeologists had interpreted as ceremonial centers, Ivor saw as astronomical gardens. The stone slabs were found only in sacred astronomical navigational grounds. Ivor deduced the answer. When he saw the drawings and description of the Peruvian guaras, he knew what the function of the lapidas had been. For guaras and lapidas had functioned as the same thing. Navigational centerboards. What Columbus and his son didn't realize was that the burial the Costa Rican Indians wanted him to witness was not of a king, but that of another great sailor, an important pre-Columbian navigator whose grave had been covered by a stone lapida. It makes sense that the navigators would be buried under the replica of an instrument that made their long and difficult voyages possible, both as an honor and as a way to steer them in the journeys of the afterlife. Columbus showed little appreciation for symbols of navigation and put no particular emphasis on the encounter. Disregarding the stone lapidas, Columbus' first inquiries of the people he encountered were of the gold, pendants, discs, and other adornments they wore. The Indians, in parentheses, told him that they had obtained their gold from a fabulous people who lived on the far coast of their land. These people were called the Ciguarenses, a sea-going people, and that they brought vast riches and cargoes filled with gold, silver, and precious stones from distant lands. The following is Columbus' own account, according to Felipe Valentini's work, The Fourth Voyage of Christopher Columbus. In all the places where I had gone, I found it to be true that I had heard. This is true about the province of Ciguare, which according to them is described as 9 days by foot towards west. There, they say, is infinite gold, and they wear corals on their heads, and rings of coral on their feet and arms, and very thick rings, and also stools, chests, tables are covered with coral. They also said that the women wore necklaces that went from the head to the shoulders. And what I say, all the people from these places coincide, and they say so much that I would be glad to have 10%. They also use black pepper. In Ciguares, their custom is to exchange merchandise in their markets. These people tell us this, and they showed me the way they traded cheaply. Others tell us that the ships bring cannons, arrows, swords, armor plates. The people go about fully dressed. On land, there are horses, and they make war. Listen, there are horses. Land, they had horses. Listen, they didn't bring horses. They had horses. All right? Horses are from America. They wear rich garments, and they have good things. It is also said that the sea forms an arch around Ciguare. And from there, 10 days walk is the river Ganges. The river Ganges. All right, listen to this, man. The river Ganges. We're in Costa Rica and Panama, this area. This is where we are. It looks like these lands are far from Veragua as Tortosa is from Fuenterrabia or Pisa from Venecia. The local people were apparently indicating two things to Columbus. First, a people different in customs to their own existed on the Pacific coast in southern Costa Rica who called themselves the Ciguare. Second, that the Ciguare possessed naval equipment, gold objects, and naval culture similar to that which Columbus seemed to represent. These people, the Ciguarenese, were never found, although recent finds of gold pendants associated with navigational tools in the Diquis Delta near present-day Golfito, about a 10-day walk from Limon, and about which the sea forms an arch, indicate that such a naval culture did exist. The great spheres of Diquis Delta had apparently been long buried, but it is obvious that even as late as time of Columbus, that region was held in high esteem as the center of a naval culture. Right, they're talking about here Costa Rica. It has recently been determined by the authors that the site described in the Diquis Delta was no ordinary naval culture, but a highly advanced ancient astral navigation university. Okay, here in Costa Rica, ancient world, the real true old world, so-called Atlantis. 60 years after Columbus, Vasquez de Coronado, endeavoring to conquer this geographical area, hired several large Indian piraguas and their crews. These long canoes had been sailing north from Panama along the Pacific coast. The size of the vessels, with 18 rowers on each side, and the distances the large boats covered, indicated that sophisticated naval orientations and techniques were present along the Pacific coast of present-day Panama and Costa Rica. Motivated typically by the quest for gold, Coronado was also seeking naval passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Under his command, the piraguas began exploring the major rivers of the area looking for a passage to the Caribbean. Between the mouths of the Diquis and Sierpe rivers, Coronado encountered the fortified city of Coctu, which lay in the Diquis Delta. Coctu could have been described as a city-state, a city-state laid out in the form of a ship. Coronado's description of Coctu related an ordered construction and gardens of great beauty. Gardens of great beauty, this is here in Costa Rica, right? May well have been a description of the home of the Ciguares. His admiration for the city, which he described as beyond comparison to anything ever seen by the Spaniards, was all the more exceptional since he had lost several men in his efforts to subdue Coctu. With the aid of the Panamanian Indians, so they brought their hijacked allied Indians, Coronado and his conquistadors eventually gained the surrender of this city of 33,600 people. Although its probable location is known, no trace of it remains today. That's the hijack. They don't want to tell you. After the surrender of Coctu, Coronado and his men encountered a great flooding of the Sierpe and Diquis rivers. They took refuge with some friendly Indians who lived in houses built on thick stilts several meters above the plain. Coronado did not know it, but the refuge he and his men had taken was only a few miles from giant spheres that would one day help solve a central mystery of the peoples of the Americas. Based on similarities in jade carvings, pottery, and ornaments, Ivor Sapp felt certain that the peoples who lived in the region of the stone spheres of Costa Rica and the Guara navigators of Peru had shared a common navigational culture. The seafaring Ciguares, Jaguares, described to Columbus, and the Guara navigators of Peru might have been the same people. Come on, Guares, come on. The fact that it was in Costa Rica, not in Peru, that the Guares were immortalized in stone pointed to Costa Rica as the likely center for the navigator priest. The navigator priest, listen to this, navigator priest. some cons in the ships. Ivar faced two major obstacles in providing his case. The first obstacle was that indigenous population of Costa Rica virtually disappeared within a few generations of the arrival of the Spanish. I dodged the hijack because we still here. Much of the disappearance was attributed to the influenza and smallpox, and much of it was due to the cruelty of the conquering Spanish. No written record of the natives' people existence survived the conquest. All right, dodge the hijack. Let's go to this image right here. Now take a look at this. This is what he's comparing. It says here, stone lapidas found only in Costa Rica correspond to wooden guadas found in Peru. Comparing lapidas and guadas, Ivar found that they are in uniform in width, length, and thickness. The lapidas are usually thin for stone carvings, generally less than 2 inches in thickness. The most striking similarities are in the ornate carvings that form the top borders and handles of both lapidas and guadas. An often repeated motif is that of 5 to 8 carved men standing side by side holding hands. Another repeated motif in Costa Rica depicts twins, sometimes twin birds, all right, twins, sometimes twin beasts, sometimes twin man beasts. And the concept of twins harken back to Plato's description of Atlantis. All right, listen to this, twins, a great empire divided among 5 sets of twins. The stone arrangement of the twins also often imply navigational directions. All right, twins, just like Plato describes. Here's another image right here. This is Ivar Sapp himself, the author. It says here, inspecting a sphere. After years of study of the mysterious spheres, Ivar Sapp noticed the similarity in the layout of the spheres to ley lines that are found in the British Isles and to sighting stones found in the Pacific. Suddenly, the thought occurred to Ivar that these were navigational tools. Through an examination of the probable functions of the spheres, Ivar Sapp came to understand that they not only represented celestial bodies, but that they also indicated ley lines that connected the sites of ancient cultures and the routes of ancient navigators. Continuing the book, it says, however, Ivar has found possible evidence that the more sophisticated navigational peoples of Costa Rica, on hearing of the terrible conquistadors, had simply sailed away into the Pacific, taking what written records they might have had with them. But they could not take the stone spheres. Listen to this. Ancient Costa Ricans, right? They're saying some of them might have become Southeast Asians. What Columbus and Coronado failed to recognize was, in fact, the last vestige of the great navigational culture of the Americas, one that drew on its memories and lessons back to the golden age of navigation and to traces of man's greatest age on Earth. What the American navigational cultures had retained knowledge of, and what Columbus almost rediscovered, was the remnants of the civilization that had given birth to the Sumerian, Egyptian, Basque, and Celtic cultures. All right, bomb drop. Woo, mic drop. Sorry about that. It's just, come on, man. I'm gonna repeat it again. Pay attention, all Pan-Africans out there. Another source, more correlation. All right, America is the truer world. Who civilized who? What the American navigational cultures had retained knowledge of, and what Columbus almost rediscovered, was the remnants of the civilization that had given birth to the Sumerians, Egyptian, Basque, and Celtic cultures. All right, okay, America is mama, grandma, all right, oldest people on earth. While these other cultures had all but forgotten the continent across the sea, only the Phoenicians of Carthage visited there regularly. All right, who's the Phoenicians? I told you they were coming from here. Whether knowledge of the Americas was a Phoenician rediscovery or simply a continuation of use of trade routes long known to ancient sea peoples is unknown, but there is strong evidence that the latter is closer to the truth. Ivar realized that if his hypothesis that the spheres were teaching instruments of a naval culture was to be tested, he would have to study a known naval culture, one where ancient traditions and techniques were still in use. Ivar sought the advice of archaeologists at the University of Costa Rica. They agreed that his theory was both startling and promising, but none seemed to know of culture where ancient navigational techniques were still practiced. Then a friend gave Ivor a book that would profoundly influence and confirm his perspective on ancient man. The book was We, the Navigators by David Lewis. In this book, Lewis presents a wealth of information on a Pacific-wide system of navigational learning, much of it still alive in the late 1960s. When Lewis undertook to recreate the routes of ancient voyagers, Lewis voyaged over 13,000 nautical miles sailing under the guidance of native islanders on native crafts, using native star paths taught to his guides by their fathers and their fathers' fathers, without benefit of any modern navigational equipment or techniques. Lewis and his island mentors never once failed to reach their often distant intended landfall. You hearing that? They did it the natural way. Lewis' exploits, primarily accomplished on outrigger canoes, are riveting, yet on reading Lewis' record, what first caught Ivor's eye was the description of sighting stones. Although Lewis' sources spoke of many stone astronomical gardens throughout the Pacific, Lewis was only able to report personally on stones on Niafayos in Tonga and on Butaritaris and Orari, respectively, the northernmost and southernmost of the Gilbert Islands. The Gilbertese called the unusual configuration of stones that stand near the northwestern point of Arorae the Atibu ni Borao, the stones for voyaging. They, wow. First mapped by Captain E.V. Ward in 1946. When there were 13 stones, there are now 8. They were described as flat slabs of coral about 5 feet by 4 feet and about 6 inches thick, set on edge and secured by paving. Lewis describes the voyaging stones of Arorae as mostly grouped in 3 in the manner shown, to indicate the bearings of islands in the southern Gilberts and Banaba. Lewis adds, sighting stones seem to have been used to align canoes on taking departure in the same manner as natural landmarks, and probably also for recording and teaching star courses. The sighting stones that Lewis describes in the Gilbert Islands of the Polynesia were similarly constructed and were laid out in configurations very like those of the spheres of Costa Rica. Sapp examined Lewis' maps and found again that by extending their express lines and angles, they led to the initiation of sea routes that extended to major archipelagos of the Pacific Ocean. Because 99% of the Pacific is open water, could the chance that sighting stones led directly to landfall be by chance? Further research into the oral tradition of the islanders revealed that the stone arrangements of Arorae were used by the navigator caste of the Polynesians to teach star patterns to their sons or daughters. The eldest offspring were students virtually all their lives, learning the names of stars that aligned themselves with the stones on given dates during the year. The stones had been placed in such manner that these horizon stars would align with the stones at the best time of year to initiate a certain sailing course. In addition to horizon stars, the students were taught sailing by reference to zenith stars, star paths, and star columns, all requiring an exact knowledge of hundreds of stars and star constellations. A navigational university was at work in Arorae and had been at work for thousands of years. Most Europeans who encountered the Polynesians regarded their methods and their boats with scorn, but the methods at least were far superior to anything the Europeans had devised, all right? Through David Lewis' research, Ivor learned that the people of Polynesia were in possession of a highly sophisticated and evolved know-how about navigation. Ivor wondered, could it be that the people of South Central and North America also had such knowledge? The spheres of Costa Rica were similar but far older and far more sophisticated than the sighting stones of the Gilbert Islands, all right? It's far older here in Costa Rica, these stones, and more sophisticated, okay? The possible function of the mysterious monolithic stone spheres indicated that, unsuspected by land-based archaeologists, a great naval culture may have existed in Central America. In Ivor's view, the directional information contained in the layout of stone spheres demanded a reevaluation of the current perspectives and archaeological models applied to the civilizations found in America. The sighting stones of Arorae and their use as teaching instruments confirmed Ivor's hypothesis, but no reputable archaeologist had ever hinted that the pre-Columbian peoples of America practiced the long-range oceanic navigation implied by the stone fears of the Diquis Delta. Explorer theorist Thor Heyerdahl, famed for his voyages on the Kon-Tiki from Peru to New Zealand and the Ra expeditions in which he voyaged from Egypt to the Antilles, stood alone in realizing the navigational capabilities of early Americans. But Heyerdahl was dismissed as a lucky adventurer by the archaeological establishment. Heyerdahl's theory of ancient navigation by papyrus boats and balsa rafts, despite his achievements, was not probable as actual historic record, due to the extremely soft nature of the materials used in their construction. No ancient ships were likely to be found. In truth, archaeologists have not, until only very recently, looked for navigational instruments at archaeological sites. For Ivor, by contrast, the discovery of the function of one navigational object led to the search for another. Seeking traces of navigational function in gold pendants, jade knives, huge ceramic pots of the type necessary for storage of water on long-distance voyages, stone water mirrors, and other objects, he was rarely disappointed. Among the items that stood out prominently above the others were repeated and dominant themes of the four-sided, sometimes eight-sided, Atlantean cross and the shallow concave bowls held by four Atlanteans. Ivor's investigation of the archaeological record showed that pre-Columbian Costa Rica shared cultural patterns whose origins could be found everywhere throughout the Americas. Listen, man, that's deep. Wow. From the shared Atlantis motif of the Toltecs to the navigational instruments of the early Peruvians. As such, ancient Costa Rica must have constituted a melting pot of navigational cultures, just as cultural port cities today, such as New York and Hong Kong, represent a diversity of cultural traits. Ivor was certain that the evidence put Costa Rica squarely in the middle of an ancient navigational culture, one that not only existed contemporaneously with the formative Maya, the Olmecs, and pre-Incas, but very possibly predated them. All right, very possibly predated them, okay? Predated them. Hadn't others made the connection? Ivor studied all the recent publications of Americanists, consulted and interviewed the available archaeologists in Costa Rica. It seemed they had not. Pursuing what we could characterize as a terrestrial imperative, archaeologists had collectively disdained any navigational abilities of Native Americans, with the exception of Thor Heyerdahl, who academic authorities scoffed at as a lucky amateur, and the distinguished Near East scholar Cyrus Gordon, author of Before Columbus, no voice spoke up for the Americas as a navigational culture. He pointed out some Pan-Africans there, right? So Cyrus Gordon wrote, that they found Negro here and it was Africans that came here. He ain't trying to give credit to the Americas. As this author is pointing out, these are Pan-Africans, all right? A lot of people try to, hey, read that book, and we have read that book, right? We have read it many times, a pretty good book, but you got to dodge the hijack a lot in that book because they're Pan-African. And again, this author is letting you know that they haven't spoken up for the Americas as navigational culture. In fact, Central America was considered to be a backwater of academic studies that had concentrated their investigations on the great ruins in the Yucatan and Guatemala to the north and to Peru in the south, all right? They haven't really been putting attention to those regions, why he's letting you know. Ivor found that no archaeologists had investigated the naval techniques by which pre-Columbian trade was sustained, even though there was ample evidence of movements of goods between all the regions of America, from the south to the north and vice versa. No archaeologist had even suggested that the fabulous calendars and observatories of the Mayans, Toltecs, and pre-Incas could have been of more functional use to navigators than to farmers, nor did any archaeologists seem to question just what the ceremonies might have been that were supposedly conducted at the ceremonial centers, except to echo the Catholic Church and insisting that pagan rites of sacrifice were somehow responsible for their precise construction. All right, so that's the hijack. The author's letting you know that's the hijack with their Catholic jargon. All right, trying to demonize people and make them savages. Ivor realized that religious ceremonies attributed by archaeologists to priests and their ceremonial centers, in parentheses, could actually have been functional universities teaching astronomy, celestial navigation, architecture, and other sciences. All right, it wasn't no sacrifice, human sacrifice. It was universities. All right, pay attention. It had been done elsewhere in the ancient world. For example, in 700 BC, the great astronomer Aratos was building spheres of stone and wood 10 feet in diameter to determine arc geometrical, in parentheses, values without the benefit of arc trigonometry. From his work involving experimentation with spheres and their latter use of teaching models, Aratos established the groundwork that would permit Eratosthenes to later reach an almost perfect description of the Earth's diameter. This knowledge and corresponding knowledge about the sun, moon, and star paths was immortalized in the image of Atlas holding the globe of the celestial vault on his back. All right, Atlas has one of these stone spheres. You see, that's what Atlas is carrying. Correspondingly, it is known that the Costa Rican water mirror, the device through which astronomers and their students sighted zenith stars and star pillars or columns, was symbolically held aloft by 4 Atlanteans, representing the 4 cardinal directions. David Lewis has shown that Polynesians had studied the stars, their pillars or columns, and their paths in an identical manner. Had correspondence been established between Greek astronomers and Mesoamerican astronomers? Between Mesoamericans and Polynesians? If navigational and astronomical knowledge and their symbolic representations existed in all 3 cultures, did it not confirm, or at least strongly suggest, navigational contact between these peoples? That's a great point, right? Why did these 3 cultures all contain myths of a golden age that perished in a great flood? The Greek gave the name Atlantic to the ocean outside the Pillars of Hercules, called Atlantis, the great empire of the Golden Age, and stressed the importance of Atlas, both the first king of Atlantis and the upholder of the heavens and the heavenly knowledge. Jet ATL, all right, listen to this, Jet ATL, right, Atlanta ATL, is not even a syllable native to the Greek language. It is key syllable in the Nahuatl and Mayan languages of the Americas. All right, that's from us. Atlatang, Atzlang. In fact, ATL in Nahuatl means water, as well as the 9th of the 20-day names in the Nahuatl calendar. Atlahua, Atlahawa, Atlahawa was the name given to the patron of fishing among the Mexica. The Mexica, Moses, who established a capital on Lake Texcoco, now Mexico City. Atlahuac was the patron of that city-state, canals and gardens, and Atlantean was the name given to the giant figures regarded as the founders of Tula. All right, you hear this? This is our language, not Greek words. Ivor recalled a phrase Cyrus Gordon once used to describe the probable importance of ancient Central America. The Mediterranean is a sea that connected lands creatively. Middle America is a land that connected oceans creatively, okay? Oceans. Inspired by Gordon's words and recognizing the strategic position of Central America and what we had begun to perceive as a vast and ancient navigational region, Ivor now asks how far back in time these correspondences might have existed. The concept of Atlas supporting the earth, Poseidon's trident, celebration of twins, circular cities, and myths of destruction by inundation all went back to Plato's Atlantis. Remembering Plato's obsession with circles and his description of Atlantis' capital city, Poseidon, as circular and ringed with canals, Ivor studied the cities and constructions of ancient Mesoamerica. Almost without exception, they were circular. and ringed with canals, encountering again Plato's description of the origins of the Atlantean people and their descent from 5 pairs of male twins. Ivor looked again at the use of twin motifs in the archaeological records of the Americas. It was there in profusion. Everywhere Ivor looked, from the atlas figures holding up shallow water mirrors to the depiction of tridents, Poseidon's symbol, to the circular canal systems that ringed Cusco and other great American cities, the evidence of Atlantis as represented in the Americas is abundant, okay? It's abundant. Wake up. Was Atlantis what we now call the Americas? Plato and the Timaeus had described Atlantis as being larger than Asia, all right? Larger than Asia. It's not just a little island. The Greek definition basically included little more than what we now call Asia Minor and Libya. That's North Africa, all of Africa except Egypt combined, all right? So imagine what is bigger than all those places. Interpretations of the location of Atlantis have put in its various places in the North Sea, near the Canary Islands, in the Mediterranean, or in Antarctica. On size alone, among known bodies of land, it could not have been any of the first 3 possibilities, okay? It's not that big. They're in those places that people tell me, no, it's in Morocco right there. It's in West Africa. That circle, you can see it from space. That's little. That's not bigger than Asia and Libya. That's just a colony of Atlantis. We went over there and colonized there, okay? But in Plato's description of a tropical paradise favored by the sun, Antarctica must be eliminated, so must any concept of a sunken region of the Atlantic. Plate tectonics simply do not show any gap in the coastlines of the Americas in opposition to Europe and Africa, except for a relatively small gap in the Caribbean region, nothing of the size of legendary Atlantis. And this gap can easily be explained by the shallow shoal waters of much of the Caribbean and the coast of Florida and Central America that once must have been part of the Atlantean continent before the floods and inundation that accompanied the end of the last ice ages. These lands were above ground and provide the fit to the tectonic puzzle. 11,500 years ago, most of the Great Bahamian Bank was exposed land. All right, listen to this. The Puerto Rican Plateau, including Virgin Islands, was a single landmass, okay? Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, that was all one land. Cuba and Florida were joined. Cuba was stuck to Florida. Listen, this is how the ancestors lived. As were Jamaica and Nicaragua. Listen, Jamaica, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica were right next to each other. Come on. Come on. And the shallow shoal waters of what are now the Windward Islands were possibly Plato's bare bones on a sunken continent, were part of an arching landmass with a few gorges connecting the Caribbean to the Atlantic. The Caribbean, greatly reduced in size from current dimensions, was almost a totally enclosed sea. Ivor's conclusion was that there could not have been a lost continent in the Atlantic Ocean, not of the size and scope Plato described. In fact, there didn't need to be a missing piece. America described Atlantis fully. You gotta understand, we're still here. The importance of Atlantis, of course, goes far beyond geographical or archaeological inquiry. Its importance goes to the heart of man's conscious purpose in the universe and to the essence of our relationship with the force that created the universe and made man the observer and measure thereof. If Atlantis was in the Americas, some vestige of cosmic awareness that constituted the heart of the last golden age should still be detectable, and it is. The evidence is that despite a physical destruction of the center of Atlantis and the worldwide destructive activities of mankind, the principles on which Atlantis was founded have endured. After an age thousands of years in duration, in which enlightened man was reduced to a simple farmer, the germs of truth, cohesion with the galactic whole reasserted its purpose again in Mesoamerica, probably 5,000 to 8,000 years ago, with the concepts of the Golden Age intact. Flourishing again for millennia, it mysteriously self-destructed just several centuries before Columbus. Its record, however, was largely still intact when Columbus arrived in the New World, in parentheses. Traces of great navigational culture greeted Columbus at every turn. How could he have missed their implications? How could subsequent science and archaeology still dismiss the spheres as an out-of-context enigma? The evidence is far from complete, and looking back into the past, we can be sure that for every navigational find we have made, thousands remain undiscovered. Most will never be found, for decay and transformation are part of the immutable laws of nature. Pyramids endure, reed boats and cloud sails perish, yet evidence of ancient seafarers has been found, and this evidence has been systematically ignored. Iver confronted established science with his new perspective on the spheres in Costa Rica. They again responded that the spheres had been constructed by Chorotegas, the earliest known people of Costa Rica. Iver objected that the spheres had been found, even by traditional archaeologists, to be too sophisticated to have been built by any known cultures of the region. Iver insisted that they must relate to the oldest known culture of Mesoamerica, the Olmecs, and that they must date back to an age when megalithic structures were being built throughout the world. The establishment answer was, simply put, do not bother established theory with out-of-context information, in parentheses. Instead, Iver enlisted the aid of writer George Erickson. Together they began a determined search for mounting evidence that would upset accepted science and establish a new paradigm, one that would include the enigmas of the Americas.
Pretty good, but your style is no match for mine. My style. Why do you want to kick me? My style. Pretty good, but your style is no match for mine. My style. Why do you want to kick me? My style. You're pretty good, but your style is no match for mine.